Today, the hill of Hizarlik in northwestern Turkey appears to be a quiet archaeological site surrounded by wind and sparse vegetation. But about 3,200 years ago, a fortified Bronze Age city stood here, controlling one of the most important maritime passages of the ancient world. This was Troy, a strategic point at the entrance to the Dardanelles Strait, through which trade routes passed between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea. Any ship traveling toward the rich regions of Asia Minor or the northern lands sailed near this hill. Control over this route meant control over the trade of metal, grain, and slaves. The city, that archaeologists call Troy 6, existed around the 13th century before our era and had a powerful defensive system. Its walls were built from large limestone blocks fitted together without mortar, with a sloping outer surface that made assaults difficult. In some places, the walls were more than 4 meters thick and reached heights of 8 meters. Towers stood at regular intervals, allowing defenders to control the approaches to the city. These walls were not symbolic. They were designed for real warfare. Inside the fortifications was the upper city, where the elite lived and administrative buildings stood. The central structure was a megaron, a rectangular hall with a hearth in the center, surrounded by columns. The ruler, or military leader, likely lived here. The houses in the upper city had stone foundations with mud brick upper structures, and their roofs were covered with reeds or wooden beams. The floors were compacted earth, sometimes coated with clay. Inside were large ceramic storage vessels called pithoi, used to store grain, oil, and wine. Below the citadel were the residential quarters of craftsmen and traders. Life there was denser and noisier. Archaeological discoveries show that the inhabitants practiced weaving, bronze working, and pottery making. Excavations have uncovered loom weights, bronze knives, arrowheads, and jewelry made from gold and semi-precious stones. This was not only a fortified city, but also a center of active production. Troy was not isolated. It maintained connections with the Mycenaean world of Greece and with Anatolian kingdoms. Pottery of Aegean style has been found in the city layers, indicating trade or cultural exchange. Some scholars believe Troy may have been an ally or vassal of the Hittite kingdom, which dominated Anatolia at the time. Hittite archives mention a city called Wilusa, which many researchers associate with Troy. A day in Troy began early. The gates opened and shepherds returning from the hills or merchants with carts passed through them. In the streets of the upper city, the air smelled of hearth smoke and fresh bread. Women ground grain on stone querns, and children helped carry water from cisterns. The city did not have paved streets in the modern sense, but stone pathways and stairways connected different levels of the hill. From the towers, one could see the plain and the sea. Guards could spot approaching ships long before they reached the shore. This gave the city a strategic advantage. In times of peace, Troy profited from trade. In times of war, it prepared for defense. Everything in its architecture spoke of an awareness of danger. Troy 6 was not a myth, but a real city with thoughtful infrastructure, strategic positioning, and developed craftsmanship. Its inhabitants lived in a society where wealth coexisted with constant readiness for conflict. As long as the walls stood, the city felt secure. But in the following decades, the density of buildings would increase, houses would become tighter, food supplies would be stored inside homes, and signs of violent destruction would appear in the archaeological layer we now call Troy 7A. From that moment begins the story of the siege that centuries later would become a legend. By the middle of the 13th century before our era, the city changed noticeably. The archaeological layer known as Troy 7A shows that space inside the walls became significantly more crowded. Houses were rebuilt, narrow passages appeared between them, and open courtyards were filled with additional rooms. Inside homes, archaeologists discovered large storage vessels buried directly into the floors, used for storing grain and oil. This was unusual for peaceful times and indicates stockpiling of supplies. Such urban density often suggests either population influx or preparation for danger. Layers from this period contain evidence of violent destruction. Stone walls were damaged, charred beams were found inside houses, and human remains lay on the floors of some rooms. Bronze arrowheads and stone sling projectiles have also been discovered. All of this points to a military conflict. Archaeology, however, cannot show us the exact sequence of events. We do not see the names of heroes or hear the speeches of commanders, only the traces of fire and destruction. If we imagine the city at this moment, it looks different from its period of prosperity. Gates close earlier than usual. More guards stand watch on the towers. In the streets, people speak about foreign ships approaching. Trade through the strait may have been the cause of conflict. Control of this route brought wealth, and competing states may have tried to deprive Troy of this advantage. At that time, strong palace centres existed in Mycenaean Greece, Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns, possessing naval forces and experience in long-distance expeditions. The inhabitants of Troy 7a lived under tension. Food reserves were stored inside homes rather than communal granaries, suggesting preparation for prolonged isolation. During a siege, the city could not rely on constant supply deliveries. Excavations have also uncovered vessels hidden beneath floors, possibly an attempt to conceal supplies from enemies or looters. Mythological tradition recorded centuries later by Homer speaks of a 10-year war, the abduction of Helen, and heroes fighting on both sides. However, archaeological evidence does not confirm a literal long multi-year siege. More likely, it was a series of military clashes or a relatively short but intense assault. The destruction layer shows no signs of long occupation by conquerors. The city was destroyed rather than captured and resettled. Researchers pay particular attention to a layer of ash covering parts of the city. The fire was powerful and spread across a large area. Burned walls and melted pottery indicate extremely high temperatures. This was not an accidental household fire, but destruction associated with warfare. In some houses, human skeletons were discovered without burial, suggesting sudden catastrophe. The legend of the Trojan horse may have arisen as a symbol of military cunning. Some historians propose that the word horse might have referred to a siege engine, or even an earthquake, since in ancient culture the horse was associated with the god Poseidon, who was also believed to cause earthquakes. Archaeological evidence indeed shows signs of possible seismic damage in the earlier layer of Troy 6. However, the destruction of Troy 7a is clearly linked to fire and violence. When the assault began, the defenders likely tried to hold the walls using towers and narrow internal passages. The sloped walls favored the defenders, but under sustained attack, even the strongest fortifications could be breached. If the enemy entered through a gate or broken wall section, fighting would have moved into the narrow streets. The dense construction that once provided protection could then have hindered retreat and evacuation. After the fire, the city was not immediately rebuilt on the same scale. A smaller settlement phase emerged on the ruins of Troy 7a, indicating that the catastrophe weakened the city. Yet Troy did not disappear entirely. People continued living on this hill for centuries, building new structures over the ruins. Archaeologists identify 9 major layers of Troy, each representing a different stage in its history. The siege and destruction of Troy became the foundation of one of the most famous legends of the ancient world. Beneath the poetic layer of the Iliad lies a real archaeological fact, a Bronze Age city destroyed by fire and violence. That moment marked the transition from a living trade center to a symbol of war celebrated in epic poetry. After the destruction of Troy 7a, life on the hill of Hisarlik did not cease. A new settlement appeared, though smaller and less wealthy. Architecture became simpler, walls lower, and the layout less monumental. This suggests the loss of political and economic importance. Nevertheless, the location remained strategically valuable because it controlled the Dardanelles. In the following centuries, the entire region experienced the wider crisis of the Late Bronze Age. Around the 12th century before our era, major palace centers across the eastern Mediterranean collapsed. Mycenaean palaces in Greece disappeared, the Hittite kingdom weakened, and cities along the Levantine coast were destroyed. These events are often linked to the so-called Sea Peoples, climate change, and internal conflicts. Troy was part of this broader transformation of an entire era. Centuries later, the memory of the destroyed city survived in oral tradition. The poems later attributed to Homer shaped the mythological image of Troy. In the Iliad, the city appears magnificent and wealthy, with nearly impregnable walls. These descriptions likely reflect real impressions of the powerful fortifications of Troy 6 that existed before the destruction of Troy 7a. In the 4th century before our era, Alexander the Great visited the supposed site of Troy and made sacrifices at the tomb of Achilles, seeing himself as a successor of heroic tradition. Later, the Romans linked their origins to the Trojan hero Aeneas, who according to myth fled the destroyed city and became the ancestor of Rome's founders. Troy thus became not only an archaeological site, but also a political symbol. In the 19th century, interest in Troy revived through archaeological exploration. German entrepreneur Heinrich Schliemann, inspired by Homer's texts, began excavations at Hisarlik. In the year 1873, he announced the discovery of the so-called Treasure of Priam. Later studies showed that the artifacts belonged to an earlier layer, but Schliemann's work attracted global attention and proved that a major Bronze Age city had indeed existed here. Modern research shows that Troy was not merely a fortress, but a complex multi-level settlement with a lower city, trade networks, and advanced defenses. Geophysical surveys revealed moats and additional fortifications hidden beneath the ground, demonstrating that the city was far larger than initially believed. Today, the ruins of Troy appear modest, fragments of walls, foundations, and a reconstructed wooden Trojan horse installed for visitors. Yet beneath these layers lies the history of several millennia. Troy is not a single city, but a sequence of cities built one above another. If we imagine Troy at the height of its power, we see not a mythological stage, but a real Bronze Age center, with a port, workshops, and a complex society. People traded, built homes, defended their walls, and raised children. Myth gave the city immortality, but archaeology restored its human reality. Troy became a symbol of war, cunning, and tragedy, yet behind that image stands a real historical process. The destruction of the city was part of the Bronze Age collapse, and its memory shaped the cultural identity of Greeks and Romans. Today, Troy stands both as an archaeological monument and as the source of one of the most influential stories in world culture. The union of fact and myth makes it an ideal subject for historical reconstruction, showing how legend emerges from reality. After fire, destruction, and legend, the central question remains: was the Trojan War a real event or purely literary fiction? Archaeology provides a cautious but fascinating answer. The city on the hill of Hisarlik truly existed. Archaeologists have identified at least 9 successive Troys, built one on top of another. The most likely candidate for Homer's Troy is the layer known as Troy 6 or Troy 7a, dating roughly to the 13th and 12th centuries before our era. Troy 6 was a large fortified city with walls up to 5 meters thick. The masonry consisted of carefully shaped blocks. Towers had sloped bases designed to withstand earthquakes and battering rams. The city occupied a strategic position at the entrance to the Dardanelles, Whoever controlled this narrow waterway controlled the movement of metals, grain, and slaves. In Troy 7, archaeologists discovered clear signs of violent destruction, burned buildings, arrowheads, and hastily reinforced houses. Some dwellings were converted into grain storage areas, suggesting preparation for a siege. However, there is no direct evidence that the city was destroyed specifically by an Achaean army. The Trojan horse itself has no archaeological confirmation. Most historians consider it symbolic, possibly representing a siege engine or even a metaphor for an earthquake. Characters of the Iliad, such as Achilles, Hector, Priam, and Paris, are also not confirmed by contemporary records. Yet Hittite archives mention a state called Wilusa and a ruler named Alexandru, a name strikingly similar to Alexander, another name for Paris. Thus, we can state several things with confidence. Troy existed. It was a major fortified city engaged in international trade. It was destroyed at the end of the Bronze Age. Conflicts occurred between the Aegean world and Western Anatolia. Everything else, the scale of the war, the heroes, the horse, belongs partly to reconstruction and poetic exaggeration. But it is precisely this fusion of reality and myth that makes Troy unique. Stone walls prove that the city existed, ash proves that it was destroyed, and poetry made it immortal. And perhaps that is the most important thing. Troy is not only a place on the map, it is an example of how human memory transforms a local conflict into a story that lives for 3,000 years.